Hey guys. Tonight, let's slow everything way down. If you're listening to this in bed, go ahead and dim the lights. Let your phone rest somewhere nearby. No need to stare at the screen. Just listen. Tonight, we're drifting into one of history's quieter tragedies. Not the battles. Not the executions. Not the dramatic courtroom scenes. Instead, we're talking about what happened after the cheering stopped. After the funeral bells faded. After the crown was placed on a new head. Tonight's story is about royal mistresses. And more importantly, what happened to them after the king died. Because while history loves to talk about kings and queens, it gets very quiet about the women who were once very inconvenient. So let's begin gently. Being a royal mistress was a strange job. There was no contract. No retirement plan. No pension. Your entire position depended on one thing. The king waking up alive, and still liking you. And once that stopped happening, things tended to unravel very quickly. Let's start in medieval France, because of course we are. France was basically the global headquarters of royal mistresses. The French court didn't just tolerate mistresses. It organized them. They had titles, apartments, household staffs, sometimes even political influence. And everyone pretended this was completely normal. Because it was. Until the king died. One of the earliest examples is Agnes Sorel, mistress to King Charles VII of France. Agnes was famous for many things. Her intelligence, her fashion sense, and her commitment to wearing dresses that aggressively ignored the concept of modesty. She was essentially France's first official royal mistress. Which sounds prestigious. But mostly meant she was the first woman to discover how fragile that position really was. While Charles was alive, Agnes lived comfortably. She had land, jewels, power. People hated her quietly. Because openly hating the king's favorite was a bad career move. Then Agnes died suddenly in 1450. Possibly poisoned. Possibly not. And here's the thing. Once she was gone, no one investigated very hard. Because when a mistress disappears, history tends to shrug. Her children were mostly sidelined. Her wealth redistributed. Her name gently faded into scandalous footnotes. And this set the tone for what was coming. Fast forward a bit. And we meet Diane de Poitiers, mistress of King Henry II of France. Diane was impressive. She was older than the king. Smarter than most of the court. And somehow convinced everyone she was just advising him. Sure, Diane. She held enormous power. Controlled finances. Signed documents. Basically ran France while pretending not to. And Queen Catherine de' Medici absolutely hated her. This is important. Because when Henry II died suddenly from a jousting accident, Catherine didn't scream. She didn't cry. She waited. And then she took everything back. Diane was stripped of her estates. Her jewels were reclaimed. Her influence vanished overnight. She wasn't executed. That would have been messy. Instead, she was quietly exiled to the countryside. Alive. But irrelevant. Which, in royal terms, was almost worse. This pattern repeats itself again and again. As long as the king lived, the mistress was protected. The moment he died, she became a problem that needed tidying up. Sometimes gently. Sometimes not. Let's drift over to England now. Because English kings were just as messy. They just pretended not to be. Take Alice Purrs, mistress to King Edward III. Alice began as a lady-in-waiting, which is medieval code for standing very close to the king until something happens. And something did. Edward adored her. He gave her land, money, jewels, and influence. She even sat beside him during court proceedings near the end of his life, which made everyone extremely uncomfortable. When Edward died in 1377, the court immediately turned on Alice. She was accused of corruption, manipulation. Basically everything they tolerated 5 minutes earlier. She was banished. Her wealth seized. Her reputation destroyed. She eventually clawed some of her property back through legal battles. But she never regained her position. Once the king was gone, so was her shield. Now let's slow down even more. Because sometimes, the fall wasn't immediate. Sometimes it was delayed. Enter Madame de Montespan, mistress of Louis XIV. Yes. That Louis XIV. The Sun King. The walking ego with a crown. Madame de Montespan was powerful. Witty. Sharp-tongued. She bore the king multiple children. Legitimized children, even. She thought she was untouchable. Which, historically speaking, is always when things go wrong. Louis eventually grew bored. As kings tend to do. He replaced her with a quieter woman. A more religious one. A less scandal-prone option. Madame de Montespan wasn't immediately ruined. But she was slowly edged out. Less invitations. Less access. Less warmth. And after the king died, her legacy became deeply uncomfortable. She retired to a convent. Not exactly forced. But not exactly optional either. She spent her final years surrounded by religion, regret, and the memory of how quickly power evaporates. And this is the emotional core of these stories. Royal mistresses weren't villains. They weren't heroes. They were women navigating a system designed to use them. And discard them. They didn't inherit power. They borrowed it. And borrowed power has a due date. Sometimes, the outcome was surprisingly peaceful. Sometimes, the former mistress married quietly. Or lived out her days on a small estate. But more often, she became a reminder of an old reign. And new regimes don't like reminders. In Spain, mistresses were treated with even more discomfort. Spanish courts leaned heavily into religious appearances. So when a king died, mistresses were often pressured into convents. Public repentance. Private exile. Not punishment. Just removal. A neat solution. Across Europe, the pattern stayed the same. Kings enjoyed mistresses. Courts tolerated them. Queens endured them. But death changed the math. Once the king was gone, the woman who knew his secrets became dangerous. So history gently pushed her aside. And here's the quiet irony. Many of these women helped stabilize reigns, advised policy, softened rulers. But none of that mattered once their protector was buried. As we drift toward the end of this first part, keep one thing in mind. Royal mistresses lived very loudly, and faded very quietly. And in the next part, we'll meet the women who didn't fade gently at all. Some were imprisoned. Some were erased. Some were blamed for everything that went wrong, long after the king was safely dead. Alright. Welcome back. If you drifted off a little during the last part, that's perfect. That's exactly the goal. Nothing urgent is happening here. Just history slowly shuffling past. When we left off, we were talking about how royal mistresses tended to fade. Quietly removed. Politely exiled. Sent somewhere tasteful and out of the way. But sometimes, history didn't bother being polite. Sometimes, once the king was gone, the gloves came off. So let's float gently into that version of events. One of the most common fates for a former royal mistress was imprisonment. Not dramatic dungeon imprisonment. More like administrative storage. Think castles with locked doors. Monasteries with rules. Houses where you technically lived freely, but no one ever visited. A good example is Jane Shore, mistress of King Edward IV of England. Jane was popular. Uncomfortably popular. She was known for being kind, approachable, generous, which, frankly, made her suspicious. Edward adored her. The public tolerated her. The nobility resented her quietly. And then Edward died. Immediately, Jane's position collapsed. The new regime accused her of immorality. Which is impressive, considering the previous regime had built an entire lifestyle around it. She was arrested. Forced to do public penance. Barefoot. In a thin dress. It wasn't violent. It was worse. It was humiliating. And after that, she simply disappeared from power. She lived. She married. She survived. But her story became a cautionary tale. A reminder that affection from a king had an expiration date. Now let's drift east for a moment. Because this pattern wasn't limited to Western Europe. In imperial China, royal concubines lived under an even stricter rulebook. They were ranked. catalogued, controlled. And once the emperor died, their lives were essentially frozen in place. Some were allowed to remain in the palace, living quiet, ceremonial lives. Others were forced into convent-like isolation. They were forbidden from remarrying, forbidden from leaving court life entirely. They became living relics of a previous reign. Not quite prisoners. Not quite free. Just there. And heaven help them if they were associated with political intrigue. Back in Europe, things could get more personal. Because often, the queen was finally free to act. And queens remembered everything. Let's return to France for a moment. Because France never met a court scandal it didn't want to document extensively. After the death of a king, mistresses were often blamed for anything that had gone wrong during his reign. Bad finances, her influence, political unrest, her whispers, foreign tensions. Definitely her fault. This was convenient. Dead kings can't defend themselves. And blaming a woman required very little effort. Sometimes, the punishment wasn't legal at all. It was social. Former mistresses found themselves uninvited, unmentioned, unwelcome. People crossed the room to avoid them. Letters went unanswered. Doors stayed closed. They became ghosts. One of the strangest examples of this is Barbara Palmer, mistress to Charles II of England. Barbara was bold, loud, unapologetic. She knew exactly who she was. And she was very comfortable with it. She accumulated titles, wealth, and influence. And when Charles died, she didn't vanish immediately. Instead, she lingered, which made everyone uncomfortable. The court tolerated her presence, barely. Over time, her relevance drained away. New favorites rose. New priorities emerged. Barbara aged. And courts are not kind to aging women who remind them of past indulgences. She wasn't destroyed. She was simply ignored. Which, again, was the preferred method. Now let's slow this down even more. Because sometimes, the emotional consequences mattered more than the political ones. Many former mistresses experienced something we'd recognize today as deep isolation. They had spent years surrounded by servants, attention, noise. And then suddenly, silence. No one needed their opinion anymore. No one asked for advice. No one cared. And history rarely recorded how that felt. There's also the matter of children. Because royal mistresses often bore children for kings. Children who existed in a legal gray zone. Sometimes acknowledged. Sometimes legitimized. Sometimes ignored. When the king died, those children lost their greatest advocate. Some were absorbed into the court quietly. Others were sent away, married off, or placed in religious institutions. Their mothers had no power to object. In rare cases, a former mistress managed to survive well. She invested wisely, maintained alliances, stayed discreet. These women became anomalies. History doesn't talk about them much, because survival without drama is boring. But for most, the end of a king marked the end of protection. And protection was everything. Let's gently acknowledge something else. These women were often young when they entered court life. Teenagers, sometimes. They grew up inside systems that taught them their value was conditional. Conditional on beauty, on favor, on silence. And when that system no longer needed them, it didn't offer a soft landing. Across centuries and continents, the story stayed remarkably consistent. Royal mistresses were elevated quickly and discarded quietly. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't leave monuments. They left traces, scandals, whispers, footnotes. And that's what makes their stories so strangely sad. Not tragic in a dramatic way. Just small, human, unceremonious. As we drift toward the end of this part, keep your breathing slow. Nothing urgent is coming. In the next part, we'll look at the rare exceptions. The women who refused to disappear. Who adapted. Who manipulated the system just enough to outlive it. Not heroes. Not villains. Just survivors. So rest your eyes. Hey guys. Tonight, let's do something very gentle. Very slow. Very unfair. So if you're getting ready for sleep, this is a good moment to dim the lights. Maybe roll onto your side. Let your shoulders drop a little. Tonight, we're talking about medieval justice. Which already sounds relaxing in a deeply ironic way. Specifically, we're talking about what punishments medieval women faced for crimes men routinely got away with. And just to set expectations early, this is not a story about justice. It's a story about paperwork, power, and a lot of moral flexibility. So let's ease into it. In medieval Europe, crime was not just about what you did. It was about who you were. Your gender mattered. Your class mattered. Your family mattered. And your chances of mercy depended heavily on whether people felt comfortable imagining themselves doing the same thing. Men had that advantage. Women did not. Let's start with something very simple. Adultery. Men did it constantly. Openly. Casually. Sometimes with entire side households. Kings did it. Nobles did it. Clergy absolutely did it while insisting they didn't. For men, adultery was often treated as a moral lapse. A personal weakness. A boys will be boys situation, medieval edition. For women, adultery was treated as a crime against society. Because women weren't seen as individuals. They were seen as vessels. Of honor. Of lineage. Of male pride. So when a woman committed adultery, she wasn't just unfaithful. She was dangerous. In many regions, men caught cheating faced fines, or public scolding, or nothing at all. Women faced beatings, public shaming, forced penance. In extreme cases, execution. Same act. Wildly different outcomes. And of course, this imbalance was explained very calmly by men who had never once questioned it. Let's slow down and float toward theft. Because medieval theft laws were fascinatingly selective. Men stole things all the time. Livestock, land, even people, depending on the century. If a man stole, courts often asked why. Was he hungry? Was he desperate? Was he defending his household? Very thoughtful questions. If a woman stole, the question was simpler. Why was she not under proper control? Female thieves were often punished more harshly than men for the same crimes, especially if the theft suggested independence. A woman stealing food was one thing. A woman stealing money, tools, property, that suggested agency. And medieval society found agency deeply unsettling. So women accused of theft were frequently whipped, branded, paraded through towns. Men, meanwhile, were more likely to be fined or imprisoned briefly, which was considered reasonable, and humane, and very fair, somehow. Now let's drift gently into something even quieter. Speaking. Yes. Speaking. Talking back. Arguing. Insulting someone. Men insulted each other constantly. Dueling cultures were built on it. Women doing the same thing were accused of being scolds. And scolding was a crime. Not metaphorically. Legally. Across medieval Europe, women accused of being too loud, too opinionated, or too persistent could be punished with devices like the scold's bridle, which was essentially a metal cage placed over the head, sometimes with a spike inside to press against the tongue. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to humiliate. Men shouted in taverns. Women were silenced in public. Let's pause for a moment. Take a breath. Because none of this was seen as extreme at the time. It was orderly. It was normal. It was justified by tradition. Which is one of history's favorite excuses. Now let's move into something even more abstract. Sexual behavior. Men had sex outside marriage constantly. This was documented. It was tolerated. It was occasionally joked about. Women doing the same thing faced consequences that could ruin their lives. If a woman was accused of premarital sex, she could be fined, beaten, or publicly shamed. If she became pregnant, her body became evidence. Men involved were often unnamed, unquestioned, unbothered. The woman bore the burden. Literally. Now let's gently slide into witchcraft. Because witchcraft accusations were rarely about magic. They were about control. Men accused of witchcraft existed. But women made up the vast majority of the accused. Why? Because women were healers, midwives, herbalists. They knew things. And knowledge without permission was suspicious. Men practicing medicine were scholars. Women practicing medicine were witches. Men who failed crops blamed weather. Women blamed weather were blamed for crops. The logic was flexible. Extremely flexible. And once accused, women faced punishments men almost never did. Public humiliation. Exile. Execution. Men accused of similar superstitions were more likely to face church discipline. Or be told to stop being weird. Let's float now towards something very personal. Violence. Men committed violence constantly. Against other men. Against women. Against servants. It was part of the social order. A man disciplining his household was expected. A woman defending herself was disruptive. If a woman struck a man, even in self-defense, she could face severe punishment. Because she had violated hierarchy. Men hurting women was discipline. Women hurting men was rebellion. And rebellion was dangerous. Now let's talk about murder. Because even here, the imbalance persisted. Men who killed often received contextual sympathy. Was it honor? Was it war-related? Was it emotional? Women who killed were often portrayed as unnatural. Monstrous. Especially if the victim was a husband or child. Because motherhood and obedience were considered natural states. Violence from women was seen as a rejection of their role. And rejection was punished harshly. Even accidental deaths caused by women were treated with suspicion. Intent was assumed. Men were given the benefit of doubt. Women were given moral lectures. Let's drift for a moment into the legal structure itself. Women often could not testify fully in court. Their words were worth less. They needed male guardians, male witnesses, male interpreters of their own experiences. So even defending oneself was difficult. And yet, women were still held fully accountable for crimes, even when they lacked legal agency. Which is impressive. In a deeply frustrating way. Now let's slow down again. Because despite all of this, medieval women still lived. They adapted. They navigated. They learned where the lines were. They whispered instead of shouted. They negotiated instead of confronted. They survived systems that punished them for existing incorrectly. Men broke laws and explained themselves. Women broke laws and explained their character. One was a behavior problem. The other was a moral failure. As we drift toward the end of this first part, let your breathing settle. Nothing dramatic is coming. This story doesn't escalate. It just continues. In the next part, we'll look at how class made these punishments even more uneven. How noblewomen were punished differently than peasants. And how sometimes being powerful didn't protect women at all. So close your eyes if you want. Alright. Welcome back. If you nodded off a little, that's perfect. Medieval justice is best absorbed unconsciously. When we last drifted off, we were talking about how women were punished more harshly than men for the same crimes. But now, we're going to add another layer. Because medieval society loved layers. Tonight, we're talking about class. Because in the Middle Ages, justice didn't just ask what you did or who you were. It also asked who your father was. And for women, class could either soften the blow or make it much, much stranger. Let's start with noblewomen. In theory, noblewomen were protected. They had status. They had families. They had political value. Which sounds nice. Until you realize that political value mostly meant being useful to men. When a nobleman committed a crime, it was treated as a political inconvenience. Something to manage quietly. When a noblewoman committed a crime, it was treated as a moral embarrassment. An embarrassment needed to be corrected. Take adultery again. Because medieval courts never got tired of obsessing over it. A nobleman caught cheating might be warned. Or privately scolded. Or asked to be more discreet. A noblewoman caught cheating threatened bloodlines. And bloodlines were everything. So noblewomen accused of adultery were often locked away. Not in prisons. That would be too public. Instead, they were confined to castles. Or estates. Or convents. Comfortable places. With walls. Convents deserve a quiet moment here. Because convents were medieval society's favorite solution to inconvenient women. Too rebellious. Convent. Too sexual. Convent. Too loud. Convent. Too politically awkward to punish publicly. Convent. It wasn't always framed as punishment. Sometimes it was called retirement. Or reflection. Which sounds peaceful. But usually meant permanent removal from public life. Now here's where it gets interesting. Men could choose religious life. Women were often assigned to it. Especially after crimes. Especially after scandals. Especially after surviving something embarrassing. Let's float gently to treason. Because treason was one of the few crimes where men and women were technically equal. In theory. In practice, not so much. Men accused of treason were treated as political threats. Women accused of treason were treated as corrupt influences. Men betrayed kingdoms. Women betrayed men. And that distinction mattered. A man plotting against the crown was dangerous. A woman plotting against the crown was unnatural. She was described as manipulative, seductive, emotionally unstable. Her crime was rarely framed as strategy. It was framed as personality failure. And noblewomen accused of treason often faced quiet imprisonment rather than execution. Again, not mercy. Containment. A locked tower. A supervised household. A long, silent life away from court. Because killing a noblewoman caused scandal. But erasing her slowly, That was acceptable. Now let's drift downward on the social ladder. Because peasant women had none of these buffers. No estates. No political value. No influential relatives to negotiate on their behalf. If a peasant woman committed a crime, she was punished publicly. Because public punishment was a warning. Take theft. A noblewoman stealing was a misunderstanding. A peasant woman stealing was a moral failure. Peasant women accused of theft were whipped, shamed, sometimes mutilated. Men stealing were more likely to receive fines or temporary imprisonment. Because men were expected to provide. Women were expected to obey. Now let's talk about infanticide. Quietly. Because this is one of the darkest intersections of gender and class. Unmarried women who gave birth faced enormous pressure. No support. No protection. No social safety net. If a child died, by accident, illness, or neglect, the mother was often blamed. Intent was assumed. Especially for poor women. Men involved were rarely identified. Rarely punished. Rarely mentioned. The woman absorbed the entire moral weight. For noblewomen, things were different. Their children mattered. Their mistakes were hidden. Illegitimate children were sent away quietly. Problems were solved privately. Same situation. Completely different outcomes. Now let's float back up to speech, because it applies across classes. A noblewoman who spoke too boldly might be scolded privately. A peasant woman who did the same thing could be punished publicly. Both were accused of being scolds. Only one was humiliated in the town square. And men. Men shouted. Men argued. Men insulted. Men dueled. Men wrote angry letters. And all of that was considered normal. Now let's talk about sexual assault accusations. Very slowly. Because medieval justice handled this with impressive unfairness. Men accused of sexual violence were often excused. It was framed as temptation. Misunderstanding. Heat of the moment. Women accusing men faced skepticism. Why were you there? What were you wearing? Why didn't you resist harder? These questions are depressingly familiar. And if a woman was deemed morally suspect, too poor, too outspoken, too independent, her testimony carried less weight. Sometimes no weight at all. Women who falsely accused men were punished harshly. Men who actually committed the crimes often weren't punished at all. Which sent a very clear message. Let's drift now into punishments themselves. Because medieval punishments were often symbolic. They weren't just about pain. They were about correction. Men were punished in ways that emphasized order. Women were punished in ways that emphasized shame. Public shaming devices were overwhelmingly used on women. Stocks. Pillories. Bridles. The goal wasn't deterrence. It was humiliation. To remind women of their place. Men were more likely to face fines. Because money was a masculine domain. Women were more likely to face bodily punishment. Because their bodies were seen as public property. Now let's take a quiet moment to acknowledge something. None of this required explicit hatred. It functioned smoothly because it was normal. Judges didn't wake up angry. They woke up consistent. And consistency can be more damaging than cruelty. Women internalized these rules early. They learned when to stay silent, when to plead, when to disappear. They navigated a system designed to punish them for missteps that men barely noticed. Some women resisted. Some challenged courts. Some fought accusations. A few even won. But victory rarely meant freedom. It meant survival. And survival was quiet. As we drift toward the end of this part, let your breathing slow again. Nothing escalates from here. Hey guys. Tonight, we're going to slow things way down. So if you're in bed, this is your cue. Lower the lights. Let your phone rest somewhere safe. No scrolling required. Just listening. Tonight, we're talking about witches. Not the dramatic kind with lightning and fire. The quieter kind. The tired kind. The ones who already gave the court exactly what it wanted. Because tonight's question is not why people were accused of witchcraft. History has yelled that part plenty. Tonight's question is softer. And somehow sadder. What happened to witches after they confessed? Because confession, in medieval and early modern Europe, was supposed to be the end of the story. Spoiler. It absolutely was not. So let's begin. Confessing to witchcraft was rarely voluntary. This is not shocking. But it's worth saying calmly. Confessions were encouraged through pressure. Isolation. Sleep deprivation. Religious guilt. And, yes, torture. But tonight, we're not focusing on that. Tonight, we're focusing on the strange assumption that once a woman confessed, something resolved. Because medieval authorities loved the idea of closure. They liked neat endings. They did not like loose women. Or loose ends. In theory, confession was supposed to cleanse the soul. Church doctrine emphasized repentance. Confess. Repent. Be forgiven. Very comforting on paper. In reality, confession was more like Step 1. Let's ease into a typical scenario. A woman is accused of witchcraft. Usually older. Often poor. Frequently alone. She confesses. Not because she believes she flew to a Sabbath. But because resistance is exhausting. So she agrees. Yes, she spoke to the devil. Yes, she caused illness. Yes, she did things that no one has ever seen done. The court nods. Good. Excellent. Paperwork complete. Now what? Here's the quiet truth. Confession rarely led to freedom. It led to management. Because a confessed witch wasn't just a sinner. She was proof. Proof that the system worked. Proof that evil had been identified. Proof that authority was necessary. And proof, once established, had to be dealt with carefully. In some cases, confession led directly to execution. Not dramatic execution. Administrative execution. Quick. Routine. Documented. But tonight, we're not focusing on those cases. We're focusing on the ones history whispers about. The women who lived. Because survival did not mean safety. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, confessed witches were sometimes imprisoned indefinitely. Not sentenced. Not pardoned. Just held. They were placed in towers. Or city jails. Or converted cells attached to monasteries. Alive. Fed minimally. Forgotten slowly. These women existed in legal limbo. They had confessed. Which meant guilt. But executing them might provoke sympathy. Or expense. Or questions. So the system chose silence. In Catholic regions, confession sometimes resulted in forced religious life. Convents again. Because of course, women who confessed were told their souls needed supervision. They were placed under constant observation. Prayer schedules. Rules. No visitors. Technically forgiven. Practically erased. They did not return to their villages. Villages remember too much. Now let's slow down even more. Because sometimes, confession led to something stranger. Public repentance. This was theater. The confessed witch would be marched through town. Barefoot. Wearing simple clothing. Sometimes carrying a candle. She would publicly admit her sins. The crowd would watch. Some with pity. Some with relief. Some with satisfaction. And then, she would be sent away. Not home. Away. Exile was common. Because a confessed witch could never be unknown. She could never be trusted again. Even forgiven guilt lingered. Let's float gently into England. Because England loved paperwork almost as much as it loved suspicion. In England, confession sometimes spared women from execution. Instead, they were imprisoned for life. Or sentenced to repeated public penance. Or banished from towns entirely. They were forbidden to practice trades. Forbidden to beg. Forbidden to settle. Which made survival complicated. One woman, Elizabeth Sawyer, confessed under pressure. She admitted to witchcraft in London in the early 1600s. She was older. Poor. Disabled. After her confession, she became something like a symbol. Her case was discussed. Referenced. Used. And then she was executed. Not because confession freed her. But because confession completed the narrative. The story needed an ending. But in quieter villages, endings were delayed. Some confessed witches were released. This sounds hopeful. It wasn't. Released witches returned home marked. Neighbors avoided them. Children were warned about them. Jobs vanished. Any illness. Any bad harvest. Any unexplained noise. The confessed witch was blamed. Again. Which often led to rearrest. Confession, once made, was permanent. You couldn't unsay it. Now let's drift toward Scandinavia. Because Scandinavian witch trials had their own rhythm. In Sweden, confessed witches were sometimes kept alive to testify against others. This was efficient. Confession created witnesses. Witnesses created more accusations. Accusations created momentum. Women who confessed were pressured to name names. Friends. Neighbors. Family members. And once they did, they were no longer just sinners. They were collaborators. Which made mercy awkward. Some of these women lived longer than expected. But not better. They were isolated. Distrusted. Carrying guilt imposed by authority. Their identities were rewritten. They became witches forever. Let's take a soft breath here. Because something important is happening beneath the surface. Confession did not remove danger. It transferred it. From the accused woman. To the community's memory of her. Even when courts intended mercy. Society did not. Villages remembered who confessed. Records lasted. Rumors lasted longer. A confessed witch could never be ordinary again. And here's the quiet irony. Confession was supposed to restore spiritual order. Instead, it destroyed social order. It created permanent outsiders. Women who existed in between categories. Alive, but not accepted. Forgiven, but not trusted. Free, but not safe. Some women adapted. They moved. Changed names. Lived quietly. Some vanished from records entirely. Which usually means poverty. Or early death. Or both. Confession did not cleanse them. It branded them. And brands don't fade easily. As we drift toward the end of this first part, let your breathing slow again. Nothing escalates from here. In the next part, we'll talk about women who confessed multiple times. Who recanted. Who reconfessed. Who were trapped in cycles of accusation they could never escape. Because once you became a witch in writing, you stayed one. So rest now. Alright. Welcome back. If you drifted off somewhere in the middle of that last part, that's ideal. Nothing urgent happened while you were gone. Just history doing what it does best. Repeating itself slowly. When we last left our confessed witches, they were technically forgiven. Spiritually cleaned. Legally processed. And yet, still very much stuck. So tonight, let's gently continue with what came after that so-called forgiveness. Because confession didn't end suspicion. It reorganized it. One of the strangest consequences of confession was that it made women permanently useful to the system. A confessed witch wasn't just guilty. She was experienced. She had stories, details, names, and authorities loved details. In many regions, once a woman confessed, she was pressured to confess again. Not because the first confession wasn't believed, but because it could always be improved. More detail, more demons, more accomplices. Confessions weren't static documents. They were expandable. Because why settle for one witch when you could have 12? This is how confession turned into a loop. A woman confesses. She names others. Those others are arrested. They confess. They name more. And suddenly, one exhausted woman has accidentally fueled an entire witch panic. Not intentionally. Just structurally. Some women realized this and tried to stop. They recanted, which was a mistake. Recanting a confession was treated as proof of deeper guilt. Because obviously, only a witch would lie about being a witch. The logic was airtight. Recantation meant punishment. Harsher punishment. Because now the woman wasn't just guilty. She was defiant. In Germany, women who recanted confessions were often re-imprisoned, re-questioned, reconfessed. Confession wasn't a moment. It was a process. One that rarely ended in freedom. Let's slow this down further. Because some women confessed multiple times. Not because they were indecisive, but because courts kept asking. Different judges. Different ministers. Different expectations. One confession might not satisfy the theological narrative of another court. So women were coached, encouraged, corrected. Oh no, not like that. The devil wouldn't appear that way. Try again. And they did. Each new confession dug the hole deeper. More details meant more guilt. And more guilt meant fewer exits. In some cases, women who confessed were temporarily spared execution. They were kept alive. This sounds merciful. It wasn't. They were kept alive to testify. To sit in courtrooms and point at others. To confirm stories. To lend credibility to accusations. Imagine the exhaustion. Confess. Repent. Testify. Watch neighbors fall. And then return to your cell. Still a witch. Still condemned. Still waiting. Some women were eventually executed anyway. Not because confession failed, but because confession had been fully extracted. Once their usefulness ended, their fate caught up with them. Others were sentenced to life imprisonment, which sounds less final, but often wasn't. Prisons were cold, underfunded, disease-ridden. Life sentences were short lives, quietly ending, unnoticed. Let's drift to France for a moment. Because France handled confessed witches with a particular mix of bureaucracy and resignation. confession there often led to banishment. Women were expelled from towns, told to leave immediately. No resources, no protection, just gone, which pushed many into begging, or dependence, or new accusations elsewhere. Because wandering women raised questions, and questions raised trials. Now let's talk about children. Because confessed witches often had families, and confession didn't stop at the individual. Children of confessed witches were stigmatized. They were watched, avoided, accused of inheriting evil, even if they were infants, especially if they were girls. Some children were removed from their mothers entirely, placed with relatives, or institutions, which sounds like protection, but usually meant loss. Loss of identity, loss of connection, loss of any future not already marked. Confession fractured families, quietly, permanently. Now let's float over to Italy. Because Italian courts leaned heavily on Catholic doctrine. Confessed witches there were often pressured into public repentance rituals. Extended ones. Years long. Mandatory attendance at sermons. Public prayers. Visible humility. These women lived under constant observation. Every action interpreted. Every mistake noted. They became walking sermons. And here's the strange part. Some women embraced this. Not because they believed the accusations, but because it was the only identity left to them. They became hyper-pious, over-compliant, invisible. Because invisibility was safety. Others couldn't maintain that performance. They slipped. They spoke sharply. They missed prayers. They looked tired. And suspicion returned immediately. Because witches, apparently, never really stopped being witches. Now let's slow down again. Because there's a quiet emotional cost here that history doesn't measure well. Confession rewrote memory. Women began to doubt themselves. Had they really done these things? Had they really been dangerous? When authority insists long enough, identity bends. Some women internalized guilt that wasn't theirs, and lived the rest of their lives quietly ashamed. Now let's drift to Scotland. Because Scottish witch trials were thorough. In Scotland, confessed witches were sometimes paraded repeatedly. Not once. Multiple times. Each appearance reinforcing the narrative. Each confession repeated publicly. Until the woman herself became a symbol. Not a person. After confession, some Scottish women were held for months or years, awaiting final judgment. Judgment that kept being delayed. Because trials expanded. More witches. More paperwork. More urgency. Time stretched. Lives stalled. And here's the soft truth. Many confessed witches died without formal resolution. No execution. No pardon. Just illness. Or neglect. or despair. They faded out of records. Which is history's way of saying, we stopped paying attention. Confession was supposed to end chaos. Instead, it created bureaucracy. Forms. Files. Testimonies. Women became case numbers. Examples. Evidence. Let's take a slow breath. Because none of this was chaotic. That's the unsettling part. It was orderly. Systematic. Calm. Judges believed they were doing the right thing. Clergy believed souls were being saved. Communities believed danger was being managed. And the women? They adapted. They endured. They confessed what they were told to confess. Because resistance required energy. And energy runs out. Some women did survive long lives after confession. They lived quietly. Moved carefully. Spoke rarely. They became shadows. Which, in that world, was the safest thing to be. As we drift toward the end of this part, nothing explodes. Nothing resolves. Because witch trials didn't end cleanly. They slowed. They lost interest. They found new obsessions. And confessed witches were left behind. Still marked. Still remembered. Still alone.